The grey maw of the sea swallowed the last of the mainland, leaving Dean with nothing but the churning wake and the relentless, salt-laced wind. He gripped the cold rail of the small vessel, knuckles white, the spray a stinging balm against his worn face. The journey had been long, each nautical mile a deliberate severing of ties, a physical manifestation of his retreat. He was a cartographer by trade, accustomed to measuring the world, charting its contours, but the landscape of his own grief had proven unmappable, a bottomless chasm. He'd lost his family, his compass, his very sense of direction, and now all that remained was the inheritance, an island, a crumbling cottage, and the desperate hope for absolute quiet. The boatman, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and sea, merely grunted, pointing a gnarled finger toward the approaching landmass. It rose from the mist like a forgotten god, dark and formidable. Dean shivered, despite the heavy wool of his jacket. High on a distant promontory, a stark, weathered silhouette broke the horizon, a remote monastery, its stone walls seeming to melt into the gray sky, a testament to enduring isolation. It looked abandoned, a sentinel guarding the island's solitude. As they drew closer, the island revealed its true nature, a place of stark beauty and profound desolation. Sparse, wind-battered trees clung precariously to rocky outcrops, their branches twisted into tormented shapes. The fog, a living entity, began to coil around them, obscuring the horizon, swallowing the boatman's gruff farewell as Dean stepped onto the rickety wooden dock. The planks groaned under his weight, each creak echoing the protest of something long undisturbed. The path to the cottage was little more than a goat track, overgrown with tenacious weeds and slick with perpetual dampness. The air here was different, heavier than on the dock, carrying the faint, earthy smell of decay beneath the dominant salt. He trudged upward, his boots crunching on loose shale, the only sound apart from the mournful cry of gulls circling unseen in the mist. He reached the cottage at last, a squat stone structure hunkered low against the elements, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the indifferent ocean. It was smaller than he imagined, more decrepit, a monument to the relentless assault of time and weather. His grandfather, a man he barely remembered, had lived out his days here, a solitary keeper of the light, and now, Dean. The door, swollen from years of damp, scraped open, dragging a protesting shriek across the threshold. Dust motes danced in the slitters of weak light piercing the grimy windows. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, mildew, old paper, and a faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place. Of course, power would need to be reconnected. He retrieved a small, battery-powered lantern from his bag, its beam cutting a wavering swath through the gloom. Peeling wallpaper, water stains on the ceiling, furniture draped in white sheets like ghostly sentinels. He felt a profound weariness settle into his bones, a weight heavier than any grief. In what seemed to be his grandfather's study, a small desk sat against the far wall, cluttered with forgotten ephemera. Dean ran a hand over the dusty surface, feeling the grit under his fingertips. He noticed a loose floorboard beneath the desk slightly ajar. Curiosity, a faint spark in the ashes of his despair, nudged him forward. He knelt, pushing the board aside. Inside, nestled in the shallow cavity, was a leather-bound journal and a rolled parchment. He pulled them out, the leather dry and cracked, the parchment stiff with age. The journal was filled with a spidery, faded script, indecipherable in the dim light. He set it aside for now. The parchment, however, was what truly caught his cartographer's eye. It wasn't a standard nautical chart. It was a hand-drawn map of the island, rendered in meticulous detail, but with strange, looping symbols and cryptic notation scrawled in the margins. It showed familiar landmarks, the cliffs, the cove, even a faint outline of the remote monastery. But beneath the surface, beneath the waves, there were other markings. Swirling currents, yes. It was unlike any hydrographic chart he had ever seen. The lines were too organic, too unsettling. As he traced a finger over the strange symbols, a faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath him, a low vibration that resonated in his chest. He froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creaking of the old house. It was deeper, more resonant, like something enormous struggling against a great weight far below. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, a trick of the exhausted mind, he told himself, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He glanced toward the grimy window, where the fog pressed in, a silent, gray wall. The solitude he had craved now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The small vessel shuddered against the barnacled jetty, its engine a final, sputtering cough before silence descended. Dean stepped onto the splintered wood, his boots echoing hollowly in the vast quiet. The island loomed around him, a craggy silhouette against the bruised sky, its air thick with the scent of brine and something else, something ancient and damp, like earth disturbed from a long slumber. The lighthouse, a stoic sentinel, stood at the island's highest this point, its beam already sweeping the encroaching twilight, a rhythmic pulse against the gathering gloom. The cottage was a low-slung stone structure crouched beneath the lighthouse, its windows dark, like vacant eyes. A rusted iron key, heavy in his palm, turned with a groan in the lock. The air was stale, a forgotten breath laced with the ghost of piped tobacco and the persistent dampness of the sea. Dean moved through the rooms, a stranger in a house that should have felt like family. Each creaking floorboard, each gust of wind rattling the ill-fitting sashes, was a sharp, unwelcome sound in the profound solitude. He spent the first few days in a fog of unpacking and scrubbing, trying to impose order on the inherited chaos. The cottage was small, utilitarian, filled with the sparse, weathered furniture of a man who lived a solitary existence. He catalogued his grandfather's few possessions, mostly navigational charts, worn fishing gear, and a telescope pointed perpetually toward the restless horizon. He found himself drawn to the windows, watching the sea. It was different here. The tides seemed to shift with an unnerving capriciousness. One afternoon, while Dean walked the narrow, rocky beach, the water receded with astonishing speed, pulling back far beyond its usual ebb mark. Then, as quickly as it had retreated, the tide surged back, a frothing, hungry rush that swallowed the exposed seabed, leaving Dean feeling inexplicably breathless. He attributed it to extreme weather patterns, a local anomaly he hadn't researched. The island was remote. After all, geology could be unpredictable. At first, Dean dismissed them as the mournful cry of gulls or the shriek of the wind through the eaves. But as the days bled into one another, the sounds grew more insistent, acquiring a distinct, low cadence. It wasn't human speech, not exactly, but a guttural, resonant hum that seemed to undulate beneath the roar of the surf, rising and falling in an almost rhythmic pattern. It seeped into the very fabric of the air, a constant pressure against his eardrums. He found himself straining to decipher it, his mind trying to force meaning onto the formless sound. His grief, still a raw wound, was certainly distorting his perceptions. One evening, searching for a misplaced map of the island, Dean knelt beside a heavy, sea-stained chest in the small, cramped study. The lid groaned open, releasing a cloud of dust and the pungent smell of forgotten paper and salt. Beneath bundles of old fishing nets and a tarnished brass compass, his fingers brushed against something hard and leathery. He pulled it out, a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and discolored by water damage, some of its pages swollen and fused together. It was his grandfather's. Dean recognized the familiar, looping script on the inside cover. He carried it to the flickering oil lamp, the only light he allowed himself some nights. The journal was a chronicle, not of mundane daily life, but of observations, increasingly erratic and disturbing. The early entries were precise, detailing weather patterns, shipping routes, and the local flora and fauna. But as Dean turned the brittle, salt-crusted pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, the ink bleeding in places as if written in haste or distress. Interspersed with the frantic script were crude, disturbing sketches. They weren't of the island's landscape or its wildlife. One recurring motif was a vast, gaping maw, not of any creature he knew, but of something immense and primordial, ringed with what looked like jagged, crystalline teeth. Then Dean found the warnings. They were scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, often underlined multiple times. The tide pulls, the song calls. Do not listen! There were references to ancient pacts, to things stirring beneath the waves, to a remote monastery on the far side of the island where the old ways were kept. Dean stared at the journal, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to rationalize it. His grandfather had been a recluse, alone for decades on this isolated rock. Perhaps the solitude had worn at his mind, leading him to fantastical delusions. The sketches were just the product of a lonely man's imagination, fueled by local folklore and the endless, crushing weight of the sea. He was a cartographer, a man of maps and facts, not ghost stories. He had to rationalize it. The island air, thick with the iodine tang of brine and the damp perfume of ancient earth, seemed to press in on Dean as he navigated the winding path to the lighthouse cottage. His boots, still gritty from the jetty, crunched on loose gravel, each step a small punctuation mark in the vast quiet. The cottage, a squat, weathered sentinel on the bluff, offered little comfort beyond its sturdy stone walls. He unlocked the heavy door, the groan of the hinges echoing like a sigh, and stepped into the dim interior. His initial days were a blur of unpacking and quiet reconnaissance. Dean, a cartographer by trade, found a peculiar solace in the precision of lines and contours. The island, however, defied easy mapping. Its jagged coastline and dense, gnarled woods seemed to shift in his perception, refusing to settle into a predictable form. He began his research with a few items his grandfather had left behind, a collection of faded charts, some marked with indecipherable symbols, and the journal. He opened the journal again, the brittle pages rustling. Before, the script had seemed a frantic scrawl, fragments of a mind unraveling. Now, with the island's peculiar silence ringing in his ears, a strange clarity emerged. The entries were still disjointed, but patterns began to form. Another, the ancient pact forgotten, but not broken. Dean's brow furrowed. A pact? But what? His grandfather's obsession had clearly been more than mere eccentricity. The island's isolation meant official archives were non-existent. Dean, driven by a cartographer's instinct for uncovering hidden truths, remembered an old legend whispered by the ferryman, tales of a community of scholars, hermits, and archivists living in a remote monastery on the island's eastern flank. It was a long, arduous trek through wind-blasted moors and groves of stunted, wind-sculpted trees, but the pull of the unknown was stronger than the fatigue in his limbs. Its heavy oak door, studded with iron, opened with a resonant thud after his insistent knocking. The air within was cool and dry, smelling of vellum, beeswax, and something else, a faint, almost metallic scent that Dean couldn't place. He explained his interest in the island's history, the legacy of his grandfather, and the vague, unsettling hints in the journal. Its pages were thick and yellowed, filled with intricate, hand-drawn maps and faded script. "These are the old legends," the elder murmured, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "The deep places, the sunken city, the ancient rites performed to keep the balance." Dean's gaze traced a crude map depicting an underwater city, its spires and domes sketched beneath a swirling vortex. The pact, the text implied, had been broken or perhaps merely forgotten. The pieces, disparate and terrifying, were beginning to align. He saw himself, a tiny speck, being pulled downwards by an unseen current, the pressure building in his ears until his head felt ready to burst. He woke with a gasp, his skin clammy, the phantom pressure still squeezing his skull. Dean sat up, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for the lantern, its beam cutting through the gloom. Along the baseboards of the room, creeping up the rough stone walls like an insidious vine, was a strange, bioluminescent algae. The air, already heavy with the scent of salt and damp, now carried a faint, alien aroma, metallic and sweet, like stagnant seawater mixed with something indescribably organic. It was beautiful in a horrifying, unnatural way, and it felt utterly, profoundly wrong. The island was not merely holding secrets, it was actively, physically encroaching. The forgotten pact, the sunken city, the deep calling. It wasn't just legend. It was growing, literally, within his walls. The silence was not empty. It felt stretched, taut, like a membrane about to give way. Inside the cottage, the air was colder than it should have been, a damp chill that seeped into his bones despite the mild autumn outside. He dropped his satchel onto the worn rug in the living area, the thud echoing too loudly. He dismissed it as the smell of old wiring, a house long unused, but the thought brought no comfort. He started a fire in the hearth, the crackle of kindling a welcome sound against the encroaching quiet. As the flames took hold, casting flickering shadows across the room, Dean felt a vibration, subtle at first, in the soles of his feet. It wasn't the house settling, nor the wind. It was a low, resonant hum, barely audible, yet undeniably there. Dean pressed his palm against the rough plaster of the wall, seeking its source, but the vibration simply permeated everything. It was like living inside a giant, slow-beating drum. He wandered into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over the dusty counters. A ceramic mug, left on the draining board, was now sitting on the edge of the sink, slightly askew. He was certain he'd left it centered. A small thing, easily explained by a draft, perhaps, or a tremor in the old house. But the hum intensified slightly as he looked at it, a subtle shift in its frequency that Dean felt more than heard. Later, as twilight bled across the windows, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, Dean found himself in the cramped bathroom. He looked up into the cloudy mirror, expecting to see his own tired, resolute face. Instead, for a fraction of a second, his reflection wavered. Then, just as quickly, it solidified back into his familiar features, the trick of the light, the tiredness. He blinked, shook his head. His mind was playing tricks on him. The isolation was getting to him, but the hum was real. Dean decided to confront the feeling head-on. His grandfather's study, filled with nautical charts and cryptic notes, beckoned. He pulled open a drawer in the old desk, rummaging through a stack of brittle papers. Beneath a pile of outdated tide tables, he found it. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age awakened. One entry read, dated years ago. "It stirs. The deep calls. The old ways must be in it." Another page showed a crude drawing of a symbol, a jagged, multi-pronged star, surrounded by swirling lines that mimicked ocean currents. Below it, a single, scrawled word, Offerings. Dean's breath hitched. Offerings? What? He flipped more pages, his fingers trembling. There were mentions of strange rituals, of warding symbols carved into the very timbers of the cottage, of desperate pleas for protection. And then, a name, repeated several times, underlined with frantic strokes, the Brethren of the Sunken Watch. They know. Seek the remote monastery. A remote monastery. Dean pictured the island's jagged, unforgiving coast, the sheer cliffs. He hadn't seen any monastery. Was it a code? A hidden location? Or a place his grandfather had gone, seeking answers or perhaps complicity? He looked around the small study, seeing the familiar objects anew. The old compass on the shelf, its brass tarnished, now seemed less like an antique and more like a tool for some arcane navigation. The heavy anchor chain displayed in the corner, a decorative piece, now felt like a tether or a forgotten sacrifice. The hum pulsed, growing louder, vibrating not just in the floor, but in the very air around him. He stumbled backward, knocking against the desk. In that brief moment of near-total blackness, Dean saw it. A movement at the edge of his vision, in the doorway leading to the living room. It moved with a terrible, silent grace, faster than anything should. He gasped, a choked sound, his heart lurching into a frantic rhythm that echoed the hum. He instinctively flung his arm up, a futile gesture of defense. A shiver, profound and primal, racked his entire body. Dean stood frozen, lamp clutched in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pressed his back against the desk, his eyes wide, scanning the empty doorway, the innocuous living room beyond. There was nothing there. His grandfather had been trying to ward something off, yes, but it felt more like he had been feeding it. The faded ink of his grandfather's journal bled into Dean's perception of reality. Each deciphered word a fresh bruise on his fragile composure. He sat hunched over the worn leather-bound book in the study, the lantern casting a weak, flickering circle against the encroaching gloom of the cottage. The phrase remote monastery still echoed in his mind, a dissonant chord. He hadn't seen such a structure on the island. It wasn't a physical place, he now suspected. It was a metaphor, a code, or perhaps a reference to the nature of the work his grandfather had undertaken. He'd spent the better part of the day tracing the convoluted script, cross-referencing dates, and studying the strange, angular symbols that punctuated the entries. What he'd initially dismissed as eccentric doodles now coalesced into a disturbing pattern. These weren't just observations of the sea and its moods. They were records of meticulous, ongoing endeavor. His grandfather hadn't merely been a lighthouse keeper. He had been a warden, a guardian of a far more sinister charge. The journal entries grew increasingly fragmented, punctuated by frantic scribbles and sketches that resembled ancient runes. His grandfather wasn't just documenting an ancient entity, he was actively involved in keeping it dormant. A cold tremor snaked up Dean's spine. The rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs outside seemed to deepen, to take on a new, resonant quality. It wasn't just the ocean. It was something within the ocean, a vast, unseen engine humming beneath the waves. A faint, briny tang, sharper than the usual sea air, began to permeate the study, clinging to the heavy velvet curtains and the dusty books. Dean found himself rubbing his temples, a dull ache blooming behind his eyes. The light from the lantern seemed to dim, though the wick burned steadily. He glanced up, convinced he'd seen a fleeting movement in his peripheral vision, a ripple in the air, a phantom current. There was nothing. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presence. The deep song was not a sound one heard with the ears, but felt in the marrow of one's bones. He saw faint, shimmering distortions in the air like heat haze above a distant road, though the room was cool. He gripped the journal, his knuckles white. This wasn't just his imagination, it was an intrusion. One particular entry caught his eye, a stark departure from the usual script. Dean's heart gave a sickening lurch. This wasn't just a record, it was a map. The deep song intensified, a relentless, pulsing drone that threatened to overwhelm his thoughts. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the study table. Each step was an effort, the deep song a suffocating blanket around his mind, making his limbs feel heavy, his vision swim. The rhythmic thrumming was almost unbearable here, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He found the section of wall indicated in the diagram, a seamless expanse of granite that looked no different from the rest. He ran his hands over the rough surface, searching for a seam, a discrepancy. Nothing. Then his fingers brushed against a faint indentation near the base, a subtle irregularity in the mortar between two large stones. He pressed, pushed, pulled. He remembered another detail from the journal, a symbol, a small circle with a jagged line. He looked closer at the indentation. It wasn't just a flaw, it was a shallow carving, almost eroded away by time, a small circle with a barely discernible jagged line through it. He pressed his thumb into the symbol. A low, grinding groan echoed through the stone. A section of the wall, nearly imperceptible, slid inwards with a heavy, deliberate movement, revealing a narrow, lightless opening. A gust of air, thick with the smell of damp earth, salt, and something profoundly ancient and unsettling billowed out, extinguishing the lantern's flame. Before him lay a descent into the unknown, a hidden chamber or crypt beneath the lighthouse, a testament to his grandfather's secret, horrifying pact. The last entry, scrawled in a hand that had grown frantic, spoke of a sanctuary of stone, a gateway to the deep, and a burden upon the old ways. A crude, almost childlike sketch followed, depicting what could only be the island's ancient. A cold dread settled in Dean's stomach, heavy and metallic. He had seen the monastery from a distance, a hulking silhouette on the island's northernmost bluff, but had dismissed it as another relic of a forgotten past. Now, the journal's words pulsed with an unnatural urgency. A subtle hum vibrated beneath his skin, a thrumming that felt both external and deeply internal, pulling him towards that desolate structure. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that he had to go. He stumbled out of the cottage, the lantern swinging wildly, its beams swallowed by the dense, wet fog that clung to the island like a shroud. The air tasted of salt and decay, sharp and briny. The path, barely more than a goat track, climbed steadily, the crunch of loose shale under his boots the only sound besides the distant, mournful wail of the foghorn. Tendrils of mist snaked around his ankles, cold and cloying, and the shapes of stunted trees twisted into grotesque figures, their bare branches clawing at the obscured sky. After what felt like an eternity, the monastery loomed out of the swirling gray. It was larger than he'd imagined, a fortress of rough-hewn granite, its windows long since shattered, gaping like empty eye sockets. Moss, thick and verdant, plastered its seaward walls, and the wind whistled through unseen cracks, a mournful dirge. A faint, sweetish smell, like stagnant water and ancient stone, drifted from within. He pushed the doors open further, the groan of protesting hinges echoing through the vast, empty nave. Dean's light swept across fractured altars and overturned pews, revealing a scene of utter dereliction. There, behind a collapsed stone crucifix, a seam ran vertically, almost imperceptibly, through the ancient masonry. Dean ran his gloved fingers along it, feeling a faint tremor in the stone. He pushed, then pulled, and with a low, grinding rumble, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing an narrow, descending passage. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to run back to the relative safety of his cottage. But the relentless thrumming beneath his skin intensified, overriding his fear. Stepping into the passage, Dean felt the air thicken, pressing in on him. The rough-hewn steps descended into the earth, slick with moisture. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. His lantern was useless here, swallowed by the sheer scale of the space. A faint, unearthly light permeated the air emanating from the center of the chamber. Dean stumbled forward, his boots squelching on the wet stone floor. Before him, in the heart of the cavern, was not an artifact but an opening. It was a swirling vortex, a shimmering, opaque membrane of impossible colors, deep indigos, phosphorescent greens, and a terrifying, inky black that seemed to absorb all light. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic throb, a soundless beat that reverberated through the stone, through his very bones. It was a portal, a gateway to something ancient and unfathomable. As Dean stared into its depths, the membrane rippled, and images surged forth, not as distinct pictures, but as pure, unfiltered sensation. He felt the weight of impossible depths, the pressure that would flatten bone and crush iron. Then, the vision focused, sharpened, and turned upon him. He saw himself, not Dean, but a distorted, elongated parody of a man, his skin slick with iridescent slime, his limbs contorted, his mouth stretched into a silent, gaping scream. His eyes, though were not his own, they were black, reflecting nothing, bottomless pits that held only the ancient, hungry intelligence of the deep. The entity wasn't just awakening, it was reaching. The islet was merely a stepping stone, and Dean a conduit. A choked gasp tore from his throat, the vision shattering, leaving him reeling, gasping for breath, the metallic tang of fear thick on his tongue. The entity was not merely a threat, it was a hungry, ancient god, and it intended to consume everything he knew, starting with him. The air, already heady with the scent of salt and mildew, seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from the corners of the room. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the very fabric of the space, as if the walls themselves were breathing shallowly. A page, brittle and yellowed, spoke of a growing hunger, a presence beneath the waves that had once been dormant but now stirred with malevolent intent. Dean's eyes darted across the scrawled script, his breath catching in his throat. It desires entry, his grandfather had written, to walk among us, to claim what was lost. Dean felt a cold, slick dread uncoil in his gut. The words weren't just history, they were a warning, an immediate threat. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, not gradually, but as if a door had been flung open to the abyss. Then came the sound, a low, guttural gurgle that seemed to emanate not from outside, but from within the very beams of the cottage, a sound like water churning in a vast, unseen maw. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to force the sound away, to dismiss it as the wind or the settling of old wood. It spoke of deep places, of longing, of a coming embrace. This wasn't just fear and amour, it was a violation. He saw fleeting, grotesque images in his peripheral vision, writhing tendrils, a vast, unblinking eye that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. Panic clawed at his throat. The entity wasn't just lurking, it was actively trying to break through, to possess him, to use him as a conduit. He scrambled back from the table, knocking his chair over with a clatter that echoed too loudly in the suffocating stillness. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if his skin were too thin, his bones too brittle to withstand the immense pressure. His gaze swept frantically over the open pages, then he began to flip them wildly, ignoring the chronological order, desperate for a solution. His fingers, trembling, brushed against his section tucked away near the back, almost an afterthought, written in a different, more desperate hand. It was an addendum, a final, frantic entry, stained with what looked like dried tears or seawater. He leaned in close, deciphering the faded script under the struggling lantern light. It detailed a final resort, a desperate, incomplete ritual not to destroy the entity, but to seal the rift it exploited, to sever its connection to this reality. The words were cryptic, fragmented, speaking of a confluence of energies, a specific alignment, and a profound, terrible sacrifice. It wasn't talking about a goat or some trinket. It was talking about him, or something equally personal, equally devastating. The ritual required a specific location, one where the veil was thinnest, where the ancient pact had originally been forged and broken. The remote monastery. It was the only way. But the sacrifice, what could it be? And was he capable of it? The entity's presence still pressed against him, a crushing weight, a silent promise of oblivion if he failed. He was trapped between an encroaching nightmare and a horrifying, unknown penance. The words from the journal still burned behind Dean's eyes, a stark, terrifying instruction. The remote monastery. The sacrifice. He stood in the cottage, the air thick and heady, a palpable weight that pressed against his chest, making each breath a shallow, conscious effort. Outside, the island was screaming. What had begun as an unsettling fog had mutated into an oppressive, swirling miasma. Not white, but a bruised, purplish gray that swallowed the daylight whole. Rain lashed against the window panes, not in sheets, but in stinging whips, carried by a wind that howled like a hungry beast. It wasn't merely a storm. It was the island's protest, its agony amplified by the entity's burgeoning power. The cottage itself groaned and shuddered, not just from the wind, but from an internal tremor, a deep, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards and up into his bones. He walked to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. The gnarled trees that clung to the cliffs were no longer merely buffeted. Their branches twisted and writhed, resembling skeletal arms reaching for a sky that bled an unnatural, sickly green at the horizon. Patches of moss on the rocks seemed to pulse with a faint, phosphorescent glow, and he swore he could hear a low, guttural murmur carried on the gale, just beneath the shriek of the wind. A sound too vast, too ancient to be human. He looked like a man already half consumed. He wouldn't surrender. Not yet, not after everything. He returned to the worn wooden table, the journal lying open, its pages crinkled and stained by time and salt water. He reread the final entry, his grandfather's spidery script a lifeline in the encroaching chaos. The words were a riddle, a grim pronouncement. The pact demands a forfeiture, not of blood, nor of bone, but of the self. The entity feeds on what defines us, the anchors that bend us to this world. To sever its hold, one must sever a piece of their own tether, the most cherished, the most painful, the most formative. It is a giving up, a conscious unmaking of a part of who you are. Only then can its claim be denied, its hunger starved. Dean's breath hitched, a forfeiture of the self, a conscious unmaking. He closed his eyes, the implications washing over him like an icy wave. It wasn't his life the ritual demanded, or not directly. It was something far more insidious, more intimate. It wanted his memories, the very experiences that had shaped him, particularly the raw, aching core of his grief. The entity didn't want to kill him. It wanted to consume him, piece by agonizing piece, starting with his past, his very identity. It fed on the emotional resonance of his life, the pain, the joy, the love he had lost. The realization was a punch to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. This was the true sacrifice, to survive, but to become something less, something emptied, to forget the exact curve of a smile, the particular cadence of a laugh, the warmth of a hand in his, to willingly surrender the very things he had clung to, the ghosts that kept him company in his solitude. It was a terrifying prospect, worse, in some ways, than death. Yet, as the wind outside shrieked and the cottage groaned, a strange calm settled over him. He was already losing himself to the entity's creeping influence, his reality fracturing. Perhaps this was the only way to reclaim any part of himself. He packed a small canvas bag, a compass, a thick woolen blanket, dried provisions, a flask of water. He took the old, heavy lantern, filling it with oil, its brass body cool against his palm. The journal, his grandfather's final, desperate gift, he tucked deep inside his coat. He would need its arcane symbols, its specific instructions. When he reached the remote monastery, he could almost taste the salt and rot on his tongue, a metallic tang that spoke of things not meant for the surface world. The entity was not merely exerting pressure, it was making its final push, sensing his intent, trying to break him before he could even begin. The path to the remote monastery would be treacherous, perhaps impossible. But he had no other choice. He would face the storm, both within and without. He would make the sacrifice. He would become the emptiness, and he would stop it. With a deep, shuddering breath, Dean pulled open the heavy door, stepping out into the howling, bruised chaos of the island. The journey had begun. The wind howled like a banshee through the lighthouse's iron skeleton, a furious lament that threatened to tear the structure from its rocky perch. Below, the ocean, a roiling cauldron of ink and foam slammed against the island's jagged teeth, sending plumes of spray high into the oppressive night. Dean stood in the lantern room, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone and the briny breath of the deep. His hands, steady despite the tremor that vibrated through the very floor beneath his feet, arranged the last of the ritual components. Sea-smooth stones, ancient and dark, formed a precise circle on the grimy floor. Within it, a shallow bowl held a single, shimmering drop of something impossibly old, a viscous liquid he'd carefully retrieved from a hidden crypt within the remote monastery. Its origin whispered in archaic texts he'd painstakingly deciphered. He understood now. The entity didn't crave his blood, not in the way a starving predator craved flesh. It yearned for a deeper sustenance, a more profound consumption, a conscious unmaking, a forfeiture of the self. His memories, his grief, the very essence of Dean. That was the feast it prepared. A low thrum began, vibrating not just in the air, but in the marrow of his bones. Dean took a deep breath, the air tasting of decay and ozone. He began the chant, a series of guttural, resonant syllables he'd learned from the faded parchments found within the monastery's forgotten library. The words, foreign on his tongue, seemed to resonate with the stones, with the very structure of the lighthouse, creating a strange counter-melody to the storm's fury. As the chant deepened, the thrum intensified, becoming a pervasive pressure that squeezed his chest. The air shimmered, distorting the familiar walls, making them ripple like reflections on disturbed water. Then, the entity manifested. It wasn't a physical form in the traditional sense, but a rupture in reality itself. He saw a net with his eyes, but with a deeper, more primal part of his mind, the impassable geometry of its presence. He saw fleeting, distorted images of his deepest regrets, his most profound losses, flickering at the edges of his vision. Become one with us. Dean's resolve, forged in the crucible of his grief, wavered. The temptation to simply let go, to surrender to the overwhelming pressure and the promise of oblivion, was immense. The entity was not just attacking his body. It was assaulting his very soul, trying to unravel the threads of his identity, to make him willingly offer up the sacrifice. But then, a flicker of defiance. He remembered the grandfather's journals, the desperate warnings, the terrible price paid by others. This was not an escape, it was an ending, one he had to control. He pushed back against the psychic assault, a guttural cry tearing from his throat, lost to the storm. With a renewed surge of determination, he forced his trembling hand into the bowl containing the ancient liquid. It felt like plunging his hand into liquid ice, burning and numbing all at once. He smeared the viscous substance onto the largest of the stones, drawing a sigil he'd memorized from the monastery's lore, a symbol of binding and banishment. The entity redoubled its efforts, slamming against his mind with the force of a tidal wave. The lighthouse itself seemed to groan, the metal screaming, the glass threatening to shatter. "Oh!" Dean roared, his voice raw. He closed his eyes, not against the horrifying spectacle, but to focus inward. This was the moment of forfeiture. With a conscious, agonizing effort, he began to sever the connections, to unmoor the anchors of his identity. He saw his memories, vibrant and painful, coalesce into shimmering motes of light, and, with a terrible wrench, he offered them to the sigil, to the ancient liquid, to the very air. It was a tearing, a rending of his innermost self. The pain was immense. Not physical, but a profound spiritual agony, as if a part of his soul was being flayed. But with each memory he released, each shard of self he gave, the sigil pulsed brighter, the ancient liquid within the bowl glowed with an intensifying, sickly green light. The entity's shriek became a sustained wail of frustration and rage. Dean, drained and trembling, his mind a vast, echoing chamber, pressed his forehead against the sigil, pouring the last vestiges of his will into the ritual. There was a sound like tearing fabric, impossibly loud and impossibly deep, as the rupture in reality began to mend. The visions vanished. With a final, desperate gasp, the tear sealed shut, leaving behind only the shimmering, disturbed air and the lingering scent of brine and ozone. The green light faded, leaving the lantern room in the dim, flickering glow of the storm-battered lamp. Dean slumped to the floor, his body heavy, his mind a blank slate. He felt an emptiness where his grief had once resided, where his past had been. He was a vessel, scoured clean, but at what cost? He looked at his hands, foreign somehow, and felt nothing but the faint tremor of exhaustion. The entity was gone, sealed away. But Dean was gone too, in a way that felt far more absolute. Dean's knees buckled, and he leaned heavily against the cold iron railing, his knuckles white. The entity was not just attacking his mind. It was trying to unmake him, to dissolve the very scaffolding of his being into the abyssal hum that thrummed through the lighthouse's stone. The deep psalm was no longer a distant echo but a roaring torrent, threatening to tear him from his moorings. He could feel the edges of his vision fraying, the colors bleeding, the solid world shimmering with an unnatural haze. But within that overwhelming current, a flicker of something stubborn, something forged in the crucible of his own grief, ignited. He remembered the precise lines of the old charts, the careful annotations, the specific symbols his grandfather had etched into the margins of the ancient maps. They weren't just geographical markers, they were a language, a pattern, a counter-song. With a gasp that tore at his lungs, Dean pushed himself away from the railing, his muscles screaming. He stumbled towards the central mechanism of the lantern, the massive, gleaming lenses. He'd studied its workings, meticulously cleaning and oiling it, following the notes his grandfather had left behind. He dismissed them as archaic redundancies until now. The deep song pulsed, its rhythm attempting to shatter his concentration, to make his hands tremble too much to grasp. He saw his daughter's face in the swirling patterns of the fog outside, her smile, her curious eyes. He heard her laughter, then the sound of the car hitting the guardrail. Grief, once his paralyzing adversary, now became a desperate, burning fuel. He wouldn't let this thing take him too. He pushed the lever, a heavy clunk echoing through the chamber. It wasn't the deep song. It was something else, a deeper, older frequency. He spun a brass wheel, then another, following the cryptic diagrams in his mind's eye. Each movement required immense effort, as if the very air was thickening around him, pushing back. The deep song intensified, a piercing shriek now, as if the entity sensed his intent, its fury manifesting as a crushing weight against his chest. With a final, desperate heave, Dean pulled the last, largest lever. A blinding surge of light erupted from the lantern. Not the steady beam meant for ships, but a complex, oscillating pattern that pulsed with an almost physical force. It wasn't just light. It was a wave, a silent sonic blast of pure, focused energy. The deep song shrieked again, a sound of agony and retreat, an impossible noise that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The pressure lifted, the shimmering haze receded. Dean fell to his knees, gasping, his body wrung out, every nerve ending screaming. The deep song was still there, a faint, persistent thrum beneath the waves, but it was distant, muffled, contained. He had pushed it back. The cost, however, was immediately apparent. The world, though solid again, felt subtly wrong. He felt connected to it, intimately aware of its vast, slumbering presence beneath the ocean. He was no longer just Dean, the cartographer. He was Dean, the guardian, the listener, the one who knew. He didn't remember leaving the lighthouse, only a blur of gray dawn and the taste of salt on his tongue. He stumbled, half crawling, across the rough terrain of the island, driven by an instinct he didn't understand. His feet carried him not to the small dock, but inland, through the gnarled trees and over the moss-covered stones, until a silhouette against the rising sun materialized on the highest bluff, a structure of ancient, weathered stone, its bell tower stark against the pale sky. The remote monastery. He collapsed at its heavy, oak doors, the wood cool and rough against his cheek. He was found there by a robed caretaker, a man whose face was a roadmap of deep lines, his eyes ancient and knowing. There were no questions, no exclamations of surprise, only a slow, deliberate nod, as if Dean's arrival had been expected for centuries. The deep psalm was quieter here, dulled by the thick stone walls, but it was still present, a phantom limb ache in his soul. A quiet footfall, a figure stood over him, an elder, his voice a low rumble, devoid of judgment. "You hear it now, don't you?" the elder asked, his gaze piercing. The world beneath the world. Dean could only nod, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He was safe, in a way, but he was not free. He understood now. And now, Dean was too. He drew maps, endlessly, compulsively, not of coastlines or currents, but of the shifting patterns of the deep psalm within his mind, trying to chart its ebb and flow, its subtle changes. He was no longer just a man. He was a sentinel, bound to the island's grim secret, waiting for the day the deep psalm might rise again, a living siren chart in the heart of the storm.